Welcome back to TK Tennis. So today I want to talk about my experience with Luxilon 4G in the 125 17 gauge. If you read the thumbnail where I said this is no ordinary poly, or is it? It mostly applies to stringing it. This was not a very enjoyable to actually string. And it's mostly because most polys have a lot of coil to them, sort of this motion, and that's kind of typical. But what most polys don't have is sort of this bending motion that stays in place with a pretty minor bend effect. So it sort of warps back and forth instead of just coiling, which I found to be quite different than most poly. So that's what I mean by no ordinary poly. And you'll also notice that when you bend it enough, it sort of discolors where the crink is, which is maybe happens with other polys, but you don't see it as much. And that might be just because it's gold. But this is clearly feels different on the stringing machine. And that feel translates a little bit to how it plays as well, but probably not as much as you would think. And also a shout out to Chase for becoming a supporter. If you're interested in buying me strings to help me support these string reviews, you can buy me a string using the Buy Me a Coffee link down in the description below. And this was courtesy of Chase. Actually, Chase bought me the Luxilon 4G soft, but since I haven't played with 4G in a long time, I wanted to play with 4G first before moving on to the soft. All right, so Luxilon 4G, it's a round string. It's in gold, which I must say, this is one of my favorite colors. It's a really classy, bright gold. It looks fantastic in my Head Gravity. Moving on to characteristics, let's talk about snapback. It has the normal fast snapback that you'd expect with most polys today. I sort of get tired of saying the same old thing in most of these poly string reviews, but there is a little bit of a difference here in the snapback. The thing that I did notice on the string is on the cross strings, the snapback didn't seem to be quite as good as what I might find on most other polys. I would find my cross string out of position on a somewhat regular basis, which I found odd and unique since most of the time it's the main strings that are moving the most, but the cross strings didn't always return. Now, I'm not saying that actually affected play. It didn't seem to affect play. It's just something to note in terms of snapback that it was a little bit inconsistent, at least in terms of crosses. Moving on to spin potential, I put it in the sort of normal category. I will say, compared to Head Lynx Tour, which is sort of my go-to string these days, that it didn't seem to have quite as much grip on the ball. Doesn't mean it had less spin than, say, a Head Lynx Tour. Maybe slightly, like 1%. But if you watch my videos, you know that the shape of a string does not affect how much spin potential you actually get on your shot by very much at all. If anything, it's just 1 or 2%. Your racket in the string pattern and the amount of snapback a string has much more impact on spin than the actual shape of a string. So in spin potential, I give it a normal. On power, also not much to write home about here. It sort of has that normal poly power. I still see people in the comments talking about some polys that have a lot more power than others. That's simply just not true. I've never found that to be true. There's slight variations, but for the most part, most polys get a normal, and this is no different. In terms of accuracy, it's also very good. I will say occasionally it did seem to, whether it was the lack of a little bit of a lack of grip, maybe it just wasn't quite as consistent. I was going back and forth with my other racket that had the Head Lynx Tour in it. And by, let's say 1%, we're talking such nuanced things here. I'm not saying this string had bad accuracy whatsoever. It had very good accuracy in terms of trajectory and depth. I just felt once in a while it would fly on me or would dive into the net. Maybe it was just me, but I just wanted to point it out. In terms of durability, it was average, about 6.5 to 7 hours, which is pretty typical for me. And moving on to tension maintenance, this is the surprise. If you're familiar with Alu Power 125, that tension maintenance is actually pretty poor. After about a couple hours, Alu Power 125 starts to get mushy and loses some resiliency. But tension maintenance with Luxilon 4G was high, or right almost at the highest levels compared to, let's say, Torna S7, Head Lynx Tour, and some others that I've given a high or even a high plus. I felt the tension maintenance was excellent with this string. It played incredibly well right up until where it broke. Moving on to feel, this is where it was confusing. I felt the difference stringing, and I could see the difference when I was stringing it, and that I figured would translate into the feel, how hitting into a different feel of hitting the ball, and maybe just a little bit. In terms of feel, it was crisp, but it was also just a little bit plush. So this is a great combination of crisp and plushness. It wasn't particularly lively. It certainly wasn't harsh. It certainly wasn't firm or harsh, and it certainly wasn't muted. There's not a lot of adjectives that I can use to describe this other than a crisp with a slight bit of plushness. In terms of stiffness feel, again, this is all subjective and based on what I feel between different strings, moving back and forth between testing lots of different strings. Out of scale of 1 to 10, I give this the Goldilocks number, which is a 5. It's firm, but not too firm, or let's say crisp, but not too crisp, going into that harsh category. And I put it as a 5 out of a 10. Sometimes I like polys that are a little softer, like Kirschbaum Super Smash or Orange, which gets a 3 out of 10. Head Lynx Tour, I also gave a 5 out of 10. And it pretty much, that was the string I was going back and forth on between this and that. And the stiffness was a 5 out of 10. Now let's move on to final grades. And before I do that, I want to mention a comment here from Passing Gas Man. Sorry, that username, I just had to do it. Passing Gas Man said, I appreciate the review and description of what you experienced, and he was referring to Toro line Otoro. But for the love of God, can you please stop telling people that this string or that string is not for them? He says, I promise you don't know what you're talking about. And he's a 3-5 player. Well, Passing Gas Man, I can promise you that I do know what I'm talking about, but it doesn't mean that I can predict what string is perfect for you or not. Now, you may disagree with me about Otoro, and that's fine. I'm not suggesting that my reviews are always pinpoint accurate and I can tell everybody what string they should or should not be using, because it's too subjective and it's personal preference 100% of the time. However, before I started doing these final grades based on different levels, I had a lot of people, and I still have a lot of people that text me email me and leave comments asking them what string they should use. And I try and do my best to provide some guidance. It doesn't mean I'll always pick properly, but I do have a pretty broad depth of knowledge in terms of different levels of what they probably prefer or not. And that comes from being in tennis for 40 years. That comes from stringing over 6,000 rackets for hundreds and hundreds of customers. I kind of get a sense of what people like and don't like based on their age, their gender, how well they hit, their level, and many other criteria. So I do my best. You may not always agree, and that's totally okay. But to suggest I shouldn't have these final grades based on level in the review, I think most people would disagree with that. And if I'm wrong, let me know in the comments, but please be constructive with your comments. Okay, in terms of final grades, I give this for intermediate players in sort of that 3.5 to 4.0 level, a B minus. For advanced players, 4.5 to 5.0, I give it an A minus. And for high caliber level players, I give it an A. And who would I be to say that this is not a string for high caliber players? If pros are using this string, certainly many of them do like it, and it would clearly get an A for that category. And there are many college level players that use this string as well. So it's clearly an A for high caliber players. For that 4.5 to 5.0 level player, I give it an A minus. I think there are strings that probably feel a little bit better. But I will say, going back to feel, I did notice on drop shots and touch shots that that little bit of extra plushness with this string was an advantage. So this string does seem to have a little extra sensitivity in terms of feel that some people may really enjoy. And so if you're someone who volleys a lot, you'll probably like this string a lot. Of course, I'm moving on to 4G soft next, and maybe that's even better. In terms of intermediate players, that 3.5 level player, 4.0, you still may find this to be an amazing string. Maybe you love this string and you don't agree with my grade. A B string is still an excellent string. So don't think just because I gave this string a B minus if you're a 3.5 or 4.0 level player that you won't love these strings. You very well may. I'm just doing my best to give you guidance that there's probably other strings that you'll enjoy more. They'll probably be softer for most people at 3.5 level. You'll probably enjoy something that has a little bit more plushness to it, even than this string, like a Kirschbaum Super Smash Orange. Again, some people will want something really stiff, even at that level. But most lower level players want something a little bit more comfortable and forgiving, and this wouldn't quite fit that. And what about value? Value, I give it a D, and that's simply because as a B minus or A minus string, plus being $20 for a set and $230 for a reel in the United States, Luxilon is a premium string maker, or at least premium price. And of course, I prefer strings that have the same amount of performance or better for much less money. So in terms of value, it's a D. If you love spending or you don't mind spending a lot of money on strings and you want Luxilon 4G, go for it. But I think most people sort of appreciate more budget oriented or value oriented strings that even perform even better than Luxilon. And does it perform a lot better? No, it's just my opinion that you find some strings that perform a little bit better than this. And that's what I'm here to try and impart that information that I feel out on the court. So who is it for? It's for any player who is seeking to emulate a tour professional and play with a beautiful looking string and a slightly unique feel characteristic apart from most polys. 4G will have an appeal for accuracy-centric players seeking a unique sensation that is slightly different, probably even better in 18 by 20 string patterns. I think for some reason I get the sense that it'll just be that more control-oriented player and racket where this will be even a little bit more consistent than it is in a 16-19 pattern, or an open pattern versus a closed pattern, whether that's 16-19 or 18-20, because of course you could get 16-19 patterns or 16-20 patterns that are a little bit more closed. So that's up for you to decide. Would I use it again? Yes, but only for vanity, because I think it's such an amazing looking string, but no when it comes to price and performance as a combined equation. So that's it for Luxilon 4G. The next string review will be 4G Soft. And again, thanks for Chase for supporting the channel. And I will see everybody in the next ace.